Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Real Thread channel. If you are new here, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. Today, we are going to be discussing the film Kembali Berdiri. The narrative unfurls, drawing us into the life of a figure whose trajectory, much like many celebrated artists, is marked by both dazzling heights and the quiet erosion of self. We follow this individual whose creative output has often been critically acclaimed, a testament to a rigorous discipline honed over years spent mastering their craft, perhaps drawing inspiration from the relentless perfectionism of classical masters or the raw emotional honesty of early cinema pioneers. Their early successes weren't accidental. They were built on a foundation of relentless practice. Late nights spent in solitary pursuit of the perfect angle or the most resonant note. Yet, the story quickly shifts, introducing the insidious nature of burnout, the slow fading of the initial spark that once fueled such prodigious talent. There's a sense that the very system that elevated this person now conspires to drain them. We see glimpses of past triumphs, perhaps a universally loved performance, or a groundbreaking piece of work that redefined a genre, moments that now feel distant, almost belonging to someone else. The weight of expectation, that invisible cloak woven from public adoration and critical analysis, begins to chafe. The film then introduces a counterpoint, perhaps a younger protege, or an unexpected collaborator whose own path is yet unburdened by the industry's heavy hand. This new connection serves as a mirror, reflecting not just what the protagonist has lost, but also the pure, unadulterated joy of creation that they once possessed. This younger spirit might be motivated by an almost naive ambition, perhaps inspired by the very works of our protagonist, that now feel like artifacts from a bygone era. What follows is a journey of rediscovery, not necessarily a dramatic return to superstardom, but a more intimate excavation of personal meaning. The protagonist is forced to confront the roles they have played, both on screen and off, and distinguish the curated public persona from the fragile, authentic self beneath. There are moments of stark honesty, scenes where the practiced facade cracks, revealing vulnerability that is far more compelling than any manufactured drama. The narrative suggests that true resilience isn't about instantly recapturing past glory. It's about the slow, often painful process of reassembling one's identity outside the context of professional achievement. We witness the protagonist engaging with their art in a new way, perhaps stepping away from the massive studio productions that demanded conformity and returning to smaller, more intimate projects where the stakes feel personal rather than commercial. The resolution isn't necessarily a tidy bow, but rather a quiet acceptance. The inspiration that drove the early career has transformed. It is no longer about proving something to the world, but about sustaining a personal flame. The film leaves us with the impression that the act of standing back up, of continuing to create despite the scars, is in itself the ultimate achievement, a testament to an enduring spirit that refuses to be defined solely by the spotlight it once commanded. It's a recognition that sometimes the most profound performances are the ones lived when the cameras are finally turned off. The camera lingers on the protagonist's hands, not performing some grand gesture of artistic genius, but simply gripping a worn coffee mug, the tremor noticeable only to a discerning eye, an eye perhaps trained by years of watching themselves under intense scrutiny. This character, let's call them the maestro of melancholy, had built a reputation on roles steeped in profound internal conflict. Roles that demanded an almost painful level of emotional exposure, a testament to their early training in method acting, where every breath was accounted for, every nuance explored, until it bled into authenticity. We remember that documentary from years past, the one where they spoke about drawing deeply from the well of their own adolescent alienation to fuel their breakthrough performance in that independent film that shocked the establishment. That raw energy is now muted, replaced by a careful economy of movement, a self-preservation mechanism kicking in after years of having every raw nerve laid bare for public consumption. The tension escalates not through external conflict, but through the internal friction between the celebrated image and the exhausted human beneath. Their former inspiration, that ferocious desire to capture the fleeting truth of human experience, now feels like a relentless, demanding creditor. The pressure to constantly innovate, to surpass the impossibly high bar set by their own previous milestones, that Oscar-winning turn, that musical composition that became the soundtrack to a generation's first heartbreak, has calcified into a kind of creative paralysis. It's the curse of the prodigy. Once you've touched genius, everything else feels like compromise. Enter the foil, perhaps a young documentarian or a struggling musician whose own burgeoning career is marked by an almost reckless disregard for commercial viability. This younger artist possesses an almost shocking clarity, unburdened by the ghost of past masterpieces. Their approach to their art is messy, collaborative, filled with laughter that feels alien in the hushed, sterile environment the protagonist now inhabits. This newcomer doesn't want guidance so much as they want permission to fail publicly, something the established figure has never allowed themselves to do since they were an unknown scrambling for stage time in dimly lit black box theaters. This interaction forces the protagonist to recall the sheer, unadulterated fun of making something new before metrics and market predictions suffocated the initial impulse. The emotional climax arrives not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet moment of surrender. Perhaps while reviewing old footage, not their celebrated work, but early, clumsy home videos or rehearsal tapes, the protagonist sees the unpolished hunger they've spent decades refining out of existence. There is a profound sadness in recognizing the gap between that eager beginner and the guarded veteran. The film beautifully illustrates that recovery isn't about finding the old self, but about acknowledging the accumulated wisdom and the necessary armor forged in the fires of fame. The journey back to standing involves realizing that the audience doesn't need another replica of the past. They need the honest, present reality of someone who has weathered the storm. The final scene might show them picking up an instrument or a forgotten script, the action tentative, yes, but imbued with a new, fragile sense of self-determination, suggesting that the greatest performance of all is simply showing up for your own life, regardless of the applause meter. The weariness etched around the protagonist's eyes tells a story far richer than any script they've ever memorized. This is the look of someone who has spent a lifetime perfectly calibrating their vulnerability for public consumption, a technique perhaps learned from studying the deeply layered performances of cinematic icons who understood the power of suggestion over outright display. Their career ascent was meteoric, fueled by an almost obsessive dedication to research. We hear anecdotal whispers of them living for months in isolated environments to fully inhabit complex historical figures, a dedication that verged on self-immolation in the name of authenticity. This intense method, initially their greatest strength, became the cage that held them captive, demanding continuous, unsustainable levels of personal sacrifice. The pressure to maintain that illusion of effortless brilliance manifests in small, telling details, the way they meticulously check their reflection before entering a room, ensuring the mask is firmly in place, or the clipped, almost defensive tone they adopt when asked about their current creative direction. The inspiration that once flowed like an untamed river, the raw, electric energy of seizing an idea and running with it, has now been reduced to carefully managed trickles, dictated by contractual obligations and the relentless calculus of brand management. They long for the days when a simple, passionate rehearsal in a cramped university theater felt more important than any opening night gala. The dynamic with the younger artist deepens from mere inspiration to necessary friction. The newcomer, perhaps a digital native who views traditional media structures with open skepticism, challenges the very foundations of the protagonist's carefully constructed world. This younger individual's art is immediate, disposable, and yet profoundly connected to the now, utilizing platforms the veteran views with suspicion. When the younger one casually dismisses an entire era of cinema, an era the protagonist defined, it's not an insult, but a painful reminder of temporal distance. Yet, this dismissal is liberating. It grants permission for the veteran to stop performing for ghosts. The pivot point arrives during a moment of forced stillness. Perhaps they are recuperating after a minor, stress-induced health scare, confined to a stark, quiet space far from Hollywood's clamor. It is here, stripped of the constant noise of affirmation and criticism, that the emotional core of the film resides. We see them not studying a script, but flipping through old journals filled with nascent ideas, rough sketches, and the handwriting of a person who hadn't yet learned the cost of success. The realization dawns. The real artistry wasn't in delivering the lines, but in the audacious belief that they could deliver them in the first place. The concluding movement of the narrative is about integration, not eradication. The protagonist doesn't abandon their legacy, but recontextualizes it. They begin working on something small, perhaps a piece of writing intended only for themselves, or agreeing to mentor in a non-public forum. The final image isn't of a triumphant return to the red carpet, but of the protagonist standing alone, perhaps looking out over a landscape, feeling the genuine weight of their own existence rather than the simulated weight of a character. The act of standing again is less about defiance against the industry and more about finally aligning their internal landscape with their external reality. A quiet, hard-won piece achieved through the acknowledgement that the greatest applause is the sound of one's own sustained breath. The ensuing period of tentative creation is marked by an almost painful self-consciousness, a shadow of the old perfectionism clinging to every new endeavor. This returning artist, having spent so long inhabiting the skin of others, now struggles to recognize the contours of their own genuine voice. We see them attempting to collaborate with the younger spirit again, but this time the exchange is less about tutelage and more about a shared, vulnerable exploration. The maestro of melancholy, accustomed to being the architect of every scene, must learn to relinquish control, to exist in the glorious, frightening uncertainty of co-creation. It is in these messy, unscripted moments that the true healing takes root. The younger artist, untainted by the protagonist's history, offers critique that stings because it is honest, unburdened by the need to flatter a legend. There are flashes of the old fire, moments when the inherent talent refuses to be suppressed. Perhaps while experimenting with analog recording equipment, they stumble upon a texture or a cadence that hasn't been heard in years. A sound that is intrinsically, unmistakably them, stripped of studio gloss. These small victories are celebrated internally with a quiet intensity that surpasses any external award ceremony. It's a rediscovery of process over product. The inspiration is no longer drawn from the desire to conquer the next peak, but from the sheer meditative quality of the work itself. The way clay yields under pressure, or how light falls across a vintage microphone. The film subtly addresses the theme of artistic legacy in this mature phase. The protagonist begins to understand that their early boundary-pushing work has already carved out the space for others, including their new cohort, to exist. This realization shifts the burden of expectation. They no longer need to innovate for the sake of history, but merely to stay true to the moment they inhabit. The narrative suggests a shedding of the need for monolithic greatness. Instead, value is found in authenticity, even if that authenticity is quieter, less universally consumable. The performance is no longer about convincing the masses of a fabricated reality, but about offering a small, perfectly realized piece of the truth to anyone willing to slow down and listen. The final, lingering shot might not capture them accepting a Lifetime Achievement Award, but rather sitting in a modest space, a hint of genuine, unguarded amusement playing on their lips as they finally manage to laugh without self-editing, demonstrating that the greatest act of resilience is the capacity to simply inhabit one's own skin, flaws, and all, and find profound satisfaction there. The film shifts its focus then to the reconciliation with the past, not in a confrontational manner, but as a quiet integration of memory into the present self. The protagonist, having found a fragile equilibrium, begins to engage with their extensive body of work, not as a set of untouchable monuments, but as artifacts of a previous self. There are scenes where they revisit old interviews, perhaps forced to confront their younger self's zealous, almost arrogant declarations about the permanence of art and the singular importance of their vision. This confrontation is deeply moving, revealing the protagonist's empathy for that younger, fiercely driven soul who knew everything and understood nothing about the long game of endurance. Their renewed creative efforts, though small in scale, demand an even greater level of emotional honesty than the grand theatrical roles once did. When they choose to film a short piece, perhaps entirely self-funded and shot on imperfect equipment, the camera demands that they deliver not a performance, but a testament. The inspiration here is drawn from the very act of imperfection. They allow the slight hesitations, the unintended breaths, the way the natural light catches the lines etched by time, to become essential parts of the narrative fabric. This mirrors the late career shift seen in certain revered directors who, after blockbuster successes, turn toward sparse, almost painfully intimate cinema, finding freedom in constraints rather than the unlimited budget that once promised liberation but delivered only expectation. The true depth of the character's transformation is revealed in how they handle public interaction following this quiet period of self-recalibration. They no longer view press junkets or interviews as necessary evils to be navigated with practiced charm, but as opportunities for genuine, albeit measured, exchange. When asked about the perceived decline in the sheer volume of their output, the response is measured, devoid of defensiveness. They might articulate that the wellspring of creation remains, but the energy is now devoted to conservation rather than exploitation, a philosophy learned from observing natural cycles rather than industry demands. It is a profound maturation, recognizing that sustainability is the ultimate form of career longevity. The relationship with the younger artist matures into something resembling chosen family. The protege, having absorbed the lessons of discipline and the necessary commitment to craft, now offers the veteran a window back into unmediated joy. They witness the sheer, unadulterated delight the younger person takes in a small, successful take, a reaction the protagonist realizes they haven't genuinely felt in decades, having replaced joy with professional satisfaction. This vicarious experience is powerful, reminding the established figure that the impulse to create is inherently generous, not transactional. The final note the film strikes is one of ongoing work, not closure. The standing up is not a single event, but a continuous posture against inertia. The protagonist is seen, perhaps, preparing for a small stage reading, the script open on a well-worn desk. There is no hint of the bombast that characterized their rise. Instead, there is a quiet focus, the kind one brings to tending a difficult but beloved garden. The film concludes by affirming that true artistic recovery is the slow, deliberate process of redefining success on one's own terms, long after the world has stopped handing out trophies for past deeds. The standing is firm because it is rooted not in a claim, but in the simple, persistent desire to continue making meaning. The narrative begins to circle inward, focusing on the protagonist's attempts to mend the frayed threads of their personal life, an arena far less forgiving and certainly less controllable than any film set. We see them engaging with family or long-neglected friendships, relationships strained by the years of necessary emotional absenteeism required by their intense craft. The initial foray back into domesticity is awkward. Their practiced ability to read and react to a scene partner doesn't translate well to the messy, unscripted language of intimate connection. They are often caught pausing, searching for the appropriate emotional cue where none is provided, revealing the extent to which their professional discipline has colonized their personal responsiveness. This echoes the experience of certain legendary stage actors whose intense immersion in roles left them feeling like strangers in their own homes, their emotional registers calibrated solely for the proscenium arch. The younger collaborator proves instrumental here, not as a mentor in art, but as an accidental tutor in presence. This protege, whose own career is just starting to gain traction through viral success, operates without the protagonist's crippling self-awareness. When the veteran attempts to intellectualize a simple gesture of reconciliation, perhaps buying a meaningful gift, the younger artist simply suggests doing something immediate, something tangible, like repairing a broken object in the house. This tangible act, the physical manifestation of mending something broken, becomes a potent metaphor for the protagonist's own stalled recovery. The calloused hands, once only capable of holding props or conducting orchestras of emotion on screen, slowly learn the simple friction of wood against sandpaper. The film explores the idea that fame doesn't just demand emotional output, it often necessitates the suspension of growth in certain crucial, non-professional domains. The protagonist realizes that while they have explored every conceivable human tragedy through performance, they have actively avoided the quiet, daily tragedy of emotional neglect in their own life. Inspiration for this new phase comes from the realization that true performance art is the sustained act of showing up for one's own life, a role they have consistently understudied. This concept resonates with the late career philosophical turns of certain novelists who, after achieving massive commercial success, abandoned plot-driven narratives for minimalist prose, focusing almost entirely on interior monologue and minute observation. The emotional peak arrives not in a grand revelation, but in a moment of mutual, unforced vulnerability with a former contemporary, someone who also navigated the treacherous waters of intense early success and subsequent retreat. They meet not to reminisce about accolades, but to acknowledge the shared casualties of ambition. In this quiet acknowledgement, a shared nod across a table, recognizing the specific type of exhaustion that only professional transcendence can induce, the protagonist finally releases the need to always appear the victor. It is here that the armor truly begins to corrode, not through force, but through the sheer weariness of maintaining it. The conclusion solidifies the theme of sustainable endeavor. The protagonist has found a rhythm that honors their past intensity but respects their present limits. They are not chasing the next franchise or the defining role. They are cultivating a space for thoughtful engagement. The final scene might find them teaching a single, dedicated student, not about technique, but about resilience, the necessity of carving out a sanctuary where the work can be done for its own sake, divorced from the roaring expectations of the outside world. The final image leaves the audience with the sense that while the spotlight may have dimmed, the internal light, finally allowed to burn steadily without being fanned into an unsustainable blaze, is now capable of illuminating a much longer path forward. The film then delicately navigates the complex territory of reputation management versus genuine artistic redemption. Having tentatively begun to produce new, smaller works, the protagonist faces the inevitable scrutiny of the media apparatus they once commanded. This time, however, the experience is qualitatively different. Where before, every critical review was a matter of life and death, now the sting is dulled by a newly forged internal fortitude. The character, acutely aware of their history of generating highly polarized, if influential, work, approaches this new feedback cycle with a detached curiosity, treating the written word as data rather than dogma. This mirrors the perspective adopted by certain venerable composers who, after cementing their classical canon, began treating avant-garde experimentation with a playful disregard for public reception, secure in the knowledge that their essential contribution was already secured. The true challenge surfaces when the legacy itself threatens to overshadow the present. Promoters and old colleagues attempt to lure the protagonist back into the arena of massive spectacle, promising retrospectives that sound more like eulogies than celebrations. They are offered roles that require them to simply mimic the charisma of their younger self, a prospect that now feels profoundly hollow. The internal debate is palpable, the pull of financial security and familiar adoration versus the hard-won peace of creative autonomy. We see the protagonist reviewing concept art for a potential blockbuster, a role that requires zero emotional risk, and the sheer boredom reflected in their eyes is almost tragic. They understand that replicating past success is not creation. It is mere imitation, a gilded cage fashioned from memory. In a pivotal, almost dreamlike sequence, the protagonist revisits a place from their early career, perhaps the dilapidated theater where they experienced their first genuine artistic epiphany. The space is now dusty, perhaps slated for demolition or corporate renovation. This visit is not sentimental, it is forensic. They are not mourning what was lost, but identifying the exact moment the purity of that initial drive was corrupted by the intoxicating promise of the wider world. It's a quiet moment of self-absolution, recognizing that the compromises made were not moral failings, but survival mechanisms under immense pressure. This understanding allows them to sever the lingering emotional tether to their peak era. The alliance with the younger artist finally solidifies into a true partnership when they work on a project that demands complete transparency from both sides. The younger creator, inspired by the veteran's vulnerability, sheds their own performative edginess, revealing anxieties about the ephemeral nature of digital fame. The veteran, in turn, shares practical wisdom about the necessity of maintaining creative distance from the mechanisms of distribution. They are learning from each other, not about how to perform, but about why and for whom. This shared vulnerability fosters an environment where mistakes are celebrated as necessary detours rather than catastrophic failures, a radical departure from the protagonist's decades-long experience. The film ends not with a massive comeback, but with a quiet affirmation of sustained effort. The protagonist is not suddenly cured or universally adored again. Instead, they are engaged in the deep, slow work of building something meaningful, project by project, relationship by relationship. The final scenes suggest a life built around intention rather than reaction. They might be seen reviewing archival material, but this time, not with regret or nostalgia, but with the cool, professional eye of a historian, ensuring their own narrative remains honest. The act of standing back up, the film posits, is not about leaping to the highest point again, but about finding the solid, unshakable ground from which one can choose the next, most authentic step. The final movements of the narrative turn toward the quiet cultivation of an internal landscape rich enough to sustain an artist indefinitely, independent of external validation. The protagonist begins to treat their own well-being as the most crucial artistic project, a commitment that requires a discipline perhaps even more rigorous than mastering a complex role. We witness the deliberate dismantling of old toxic habits. The late-night work sessions fueled by obligation, the constant checking of digital metrics, the ingrained need to be on, even in private moments. This process isn't presented as an overnight conversion, but as a series of small, often tiresome victories against deeply ingrained behavioral patterns. It's the hard work of reprogramming a lifetime of reflexive responses. Their engagement with their historical body of work also takes on a new dimension. Instead of shying away or basking in reflected glory, they begin curating small exhibitions or masterclasses focused on the process behind the famous pieces, deliberately highlighting the failures, the moments of doubt, and the sheer luck involved in any great success. They speak not of genius, but of collaboration and perseverance, demystifying the myth of the solitary, infallible artist. This open acknowledgement serves as a powerful form of reconciliation, allowing the younger generation to approach their own careers with a healthier set of expectations, inspired by the struggle rather than the polished outcome. This feels akin to the later careers of great writers who found their most resonant voice only after relinquishing the pressure to produce another novel of the scale of their early magnum opus. The relationship with the young collaborator evolves beyond mentorship into a recognition of mutual mentorship across generations. The veteran provides the anchor of deep, historical understanding of the craft's demands, while the younger figure offers the essential connection to the present cultural pulse, keeping the veteran's work relevant without forcing it toward pandering. When the protagonist finally agrees to participate in a major new work with the younger artist, it is not for the scale or the paycheck, but because the script genuinely challenges them to explore a type of emotional neutrality they've never dared attempt. A role that demands less outward projection, a profound act of artistic stripping away. The emotional culmination of the film isn't a loud scene, but a moment of profound silence, observed by the camera. Perhaps the protagonist is simply sitting in their newly organized workspace, surrounded by the tangible evidence of their life, old scripts, tools, photographs of loved ones, and they are utterly at peace. There is a subtle shift in their bearing. The tension that held their shoulders rigid for decades has eased. This peace isn't derived from having conquered any external enemy, but from having finally made peace with their own narrative arc, accepting that decline in one area often necessitates flourishing in another. The final image leaves us with a sense of earned continuation. The protagonist is back at work, but the framing is tight, intimate, focused purely on the immediate task, shaping clay, editing sound, writing a single, perfect sentence. There is no fanfare, no indication of public reception, only the deep satisfaction of engagement. The story asserts that to stand again is not to regain the summit that once defined you, but to construct a sustainable, meaningful plateau from which one can continue the necessary lifelong journey of creation, proving that true endurance lies in the quiet refusal to stop working, regardless of the applause. The narrative then pivots to explore the protagonist's growing commitment to the tangible reality of their surroundings, a stark contrast to the illusionary worlds they once inhabited. Having acknowledged the necessity of self-preservation, they begin to apply the same meticulous research and dedication that fueled their early career, the almost obsessive study of historical dialects, or complex physical training for demanding roles, to the mundane tasks of everyday life. We see them learning to cook intricate meals, not for show, but for nourishment, studying horticulture, finding parallel structures between the slow, predictable growth of a seed and the necessary gestation period for a truly original idea. This mirrors the discipline sought by certain acclaimed method actors who, after achieving superstardom, would retreat into highly structured manual trades during hiatuses, grounding themselves in the physical world to anchor their volatile creative energies. The irony is sharp. The artist who could flawlessly portray deep connection on screen now struggles with the simple vulnerability required to accept help or delegate tasks. This is particularly evident in their relationship with the younger collaborator, who often shows up unannounced, not to discuss art, but to insist on a shared break or a walk in a part of the city the protagonist had previously deemed beneath their notice. This immersion in the unfiltered present forces the protagonist to confront the curated isolation that fame demands. The inspiration for their current work begins to surface organically from these very interactions. The way the morning light hits the rough texture of an old brick wall, the cadence of an ordinary conversation, details previously filtered out as irrelevant background noise. The industry, sensing the protagonist's recalibration, makes one last significant attempt to lure them back into the familiar orbit of spectacle. A major studio approaches them with an offer to voice a monumental animated feature, a project promising astronomical financial returns and minimal personal exposure. For a brief moment, the temptation is powerful. The siren song of effortless, consequence-free work that requires only the recognizable timbre of their voice. However, the protagonist sees through the lure. They recognize that lending their vocal instrument to a machine designed purely for profit is the ultimate abdication of their rediscovered autonomy. This decision, made quietly over a simple cup of tea without consultation from agents or managers, is perhaps the most radical performance of the entire film, a silent rejection of the Faustian bargain they had once willingly accepted. Their emerging artistic output, though still under the radar, starts to possess a unique gravity. It is characterized by restraint. Where once there was a need to fill every frame with dramatic weight, now there is an appreciation for negative space, for the power of what is left unsaid or unseen. This aligns with the aesthetic evolution of groundbreaking conceptual artists who, after challenging boundaries, discover that the most provocative statements are often the quietest, the ones that require the viewer to actively lean in. The protagonist is no longer striving to prove they can do something. They are simply revealing what they are doing. The film culminates not in a final curtain call, but in the establishment of a lasting, sustainable, creative ecology. The protagonist is seen comfortably occupying a teaching role at a small, underfunded arts collective, sharing not techniques for achieving fame, but methods for surviving the necessary solitude of a creative life. They have integrated the weight of their past, the brilliance, the exhaustion, the necessary compromises into a functional present. The act of standing back up has resolved itself into the simple act of continuing to move forward, horizontally rather than vertically. The final shot may show them walking away from the studio space, not towards a waiting limousine, but towards a quiet evening, their silhouette unburdened. The true legacy, not the work they left behind, but the capacity they have rediscovered to begin again, every single day. The lingering emotional residue of the protagonist's journey is explored through the lens of forgiveness, both external and intensely internal. Having spent years subconsciously framing their life as a series of battles against mediocrity, against critics, against the relentless march of time, the real struggle becomes forgiving the younger, ambitious self for the sacrifices made in the name of perceived greatness. This reconciliation manifests in unexpected ways, perhaps while listening to old recordings of their own voice, where the sheer, unchecked confidence sounds almost alien. There is no harsh judgment, but rather a melancholic tenderness, an understanding that the younger self was operating with the limited blueprint available at the time. This echoes the self-compassion adopted by seasoned veterans of political life, who, upon retiring from the fray, are able to look back at their own sharp political maneuvering with a detached understanding of necessity rather than spite. The protagonist's newfound artistic endeavors begin to directly address this theme of reconciliation. If their early work was about externalizing conflict, the new work focuses on the quiet archaeology of the self. They embark on a project, perhaps a photographic essay or a series of sparse, poetic monologues, that uses personal history as raw material, but filters it through the lens of acceptance. They are no longer interested in portraying heroism or tragedy, but the simple, often contradictory texture of a life fully lived. Inspiration is drawn not from dramatic external events, but from the subtle interplay of light and shadow across a familiar room, the silent dialogue between memory and presence. The evolving relationship with the younger artist takes on a reflective quality. The protege, now experiencing their own first significant professional plateau, seeks guidance not on overcoming failure, but on navigating success without losing selfhood. The protagonist finds profound satisfaction in offering counsel that is entirely rooted in experiential wisdom, devoid of the abstract ambition that once drove them. They advise the younger artist to intentionally cultivate spaces of creative inefficiency, moments where output is not the goal, understanding that this deliberate slowing down is the only defense against the industry's inherent acceleration. It is a transfer of protective knowledge, a passing of the torch not of fame, but of endurance strategies. The film emphasizes that true recovery involves integrating the lessons of fame without being defined by its residues. The protagonist might encounter an old adversary or a former lover, someone whose relationship was irrevocably damaged by the protagonist's self-absorption during their rise. In these encounters, there is no dramatic apology or need for resolution. Instead, there is a shared acknowledgement of the past wreckage, a quiet, mutual recognition that they were all participants in a high-stakes drama whose rules they didn't fully comprehend. The absence of expected drama is itself dramatic, signaling that the need for external validation or closure has finally evaporated. The final assertion of the film is that standing back up is synonymous with achieving internal consistency. The protagonist finds themselves working late into the night again, but the atmosphere is wholly different. The focus is calm, the tools are simple, and the intention is pure. To create something true for the sake of the making itself. The camera frames them not as a celebrated figure, but as a dedicated craftsperson, a laborer in the vineyard of personal meaning. The story concludes that the most powerful act of resilience is the sustained, deliberate choice to inhabit one's own evolving truth, confirming that the greatest comeback is not to the spotlight, but to a grounded, authentic self, capable of continuous, quiet becoming. The denouement of the film shifts towards an exploration of legacy, not as a static monument carved in stone, but as a living, breathing entity, passed on through shared practice. The protagonist, having thoroughly excavated and integrated their personal history, begins to channel their accumulated wisdom into mentorship that transcends the superficialities of technique. They become less concerned with teaching how to achieve a successful career, a path they now recognize as largely arbitrary, and more focused on imparting the psychological architecture required to withstand the inevitable troughs that follow any ascent. This mirrors the late career transformation of certain esteemed directors who moved from crafting blockbuster narratives to founding robust educational programs dedicated to fostering critical thinking and ethical storytelling among the next generation. Their continued engagement with the younger artist now involves a shared sense of custodianship over their respective crafts. The protagonist encourages the younger individual to actively seek out constraints, viewing limitations not as obstacles to be overcome through sheer force of will, but as fertile ground for genuine innovation. They might show an early, discarded concept for a celebrated film, pointing out how the budget cuts forced them into a more emotionally resonant, visually spare solution, a lesson that the protagonists themselves only learned in hindsight. This mentoring is reciprocal. The younger artist challenges the protagonist's newfound tendency toward quietism, urging them to occasionally deploy their considerable communicative power when matters of genuine artistic integrity or social importance are at stake. It becomes a balanced exchange of vigor for experience. The film subtly addresses the protagonist's physical relationship with their art, showing a shift in scale that reflects their internal reorganization. No longer bound to physically demanding roles or sprawling, exhausting productions, their current projects are often tactile and immediate. They might be seen working intensely on a small, handcrafted piece of kinetic sculpture or composing short musical sketches intended only for private listening. The inspiration here is entirely derived from the immediate feedback loop between hand and material, a direct sensory experience, untainted by intermediaries or audience projection. This tactile focus serves as a potent antidote to the purely cerebral exhaustion that marked their burnout phase. A moment of profound affirmation occurs when the protagonist encounters a group of young enthusiasts who have discovered their early, obscure, avant-garde work. The pieces made before the fame, often dismissed as inaccessible. These young people don't fawn over the later celebrated hits. They cherish the raw, uncompromising experiments. This encounter validates the protagonist's most vulnerable creative choices, confirming that the artistic impulse, when pursued purely, finds its most dedicated audience regardless of commercial timing. It's a powerful realization that the most enduring aspects of one's work are often those least calculated for mass appeal. The narrative concludes not with a definitive final act, but with the establishment of an ongoing, quiet momentum. The protagonist is seen in their workspace, perhaps sketching out ideas for a future project whose scope is entirely undefined, operating without the tyranny of a deadline or a producer's mandate. The image is one of enduring engagement, a person who has successfully decoupled their intrinsic worth from their public output. To stand back up, the film suggests, is not to regain a previous height, but to secure a vantage point from which one can observe the landscape of one's life with clarity, appreciating the long, winding road traveled, and possessing the quiet confidence to keep walking, step by deliberate step, into whatever terrain lies ahead. The film Kembali Berdiri presents a nuanced exploration of ambition, resilience, and the often unseen struggles underpinning public achievement. Its narrative effectively draws the viewer into the pressurized world of competitive Indonesian cinema, focusing keenly on the central figure whose journey mirrors many striving artists navigating systemic challenges and personal doubt. The protagonist's trajectory is marked by an initial, almost naive enthusiasm, heavily informed by cinematic influences of the past. One can sense the ghost of classic Indonesian melodrama, and perhaps even early new wave sensibilities in their formative viewing habits, shaping an aesthetic that is both deeply nationalistic and yet striving for global recognition. This internal conflict between honoring legacy and forging a new path is a cornerstone of the film's dramatic tension. The technical execution, particularly the cinematography, deserves close examination. There is a deliberate choice in the visual language to contrast the glittering facade of film festivals and premieres with the stark, sometimes claustrophobic reality of pre-production and personal sacrifice. The lighting often shifts from harsh, revealing clarity during moments of intense creative conflict to a softer, more forgiving luminescence during rare moments of personal connection or artistic breakthrough. This visual metaphor reinforces the theme that success requires enduring scrutiny. Examining the supporting characters reveals the intricate ecosystem of the film industry. The producer figure, for instance, is not simply an antagonist driven by commerce, but a product of the same unforgiving economic climate. Their pragmatism, often perceived as betrayal by the artist, is subtly portrayed as a survival mechanism honed by years of watching projects fail. This complexity elevates the material beyond a simple David versus Goliath narrative. The film subtly incorporates references to the career arcs of notable Indonesian directors, perhaps echoing the perseverance seen in figures who transitioned successfully from independent shorts to feature-length success, despite limited initial infrastructure, or those who weathered periods of cultural shift. The lead character's refusal to compromise on a specific visual motif, for example, feels like a direct homage to a director known for their uncompromising vision, even at the cost of initial box office returns. The pacing of Nonton Kembali Berdiri is crucial. It avoids the rapid-fire editing common in contemporary thrillers, opting instead for lingering shots that allow the emotional weight of inaction or difficult decision-making to settle. This deliberate slowness mirrors the protracted timeline of artistic creation, where months of unseen effort culminate in moments that last only seconds on screen. Furthermore, the musical score acts as an almost external narrator. It steers clear of overly sentimental orchestration, leaning instead on atmospheric, often minimalist compositions that reflect the internal monologue of the protagonist, a sense of constant striving beneath a calm exterior. When music does swell, it is usually tied not to victory, but to the acceptance of a difficult truth regarding one's artistic limitations or compromises made along the way. Ultimately, the film operates as a meditation on endurance. It suggests that the act of standing again, as the title implies, is not about achieving a definitive endpoint, but about maintaining the structural integrity to face the next inevitable fall. It is a deeply felt piece about the burden of authorship and the necessity of belief when all external validation has momentarily faded. The final sequence, often ambiguous in its implication of future success, strongly suggests that the true victory lies in the sustained capacity for creation, regardless of reception. The emotional landscape of Kembali Berdiri is intensely rendered through the lead actor's performance, which avoids histrionics, opting instead for a portrayal rooted in quiet exhaustion. There are fleeting moments where the facade cracks, a momentary lapse in posture during a late-night script revision, or the way their gaze drifts toward an unmarked photograph on a cluttered desk, presumably an artifact from an earlier, perhaps happier, phase of their life before the relentless pursuit of this singular goal consumed everything. This quiet suffering resonates because it feels earned, built up over scenes, demonstrating the drudgery of seeking funding, the soul-crushing nature of notes from executives who fundamentally misunderstand the vision, and the isolation inherent in maintaining creative integrity under pressure. The film skillfully employs the setting of Jakarta's bustling creative hubs and the sterile quiet of private residences to mirror the protagonist's psychological state. When they are amidst the noise of production, shouting demands on set, negotiating contracts in overly air-conditioned boardrooms, the energy is manic, desperate. Yet, the most revealing scenes occur in the solitude of their apartment, often lit only by the glow of a monitor displaying rejection emails or early cuts. Here we see the toll of sacrificing relationships. The absence of a consistent partner or supportive family structure is palpable, an unspoken cost of ambition that the film never judges but simply presents as fact. One compelling dynamic involves the collaboration with the lead cinematographer, a figure whose own career trajectory might parallel that of respected Indonesian cinematographers, known for adapting their style across different genres while maintaining a distinct textural quality. This relationship is characterized by unspoken shorthand and mutual respect, serving as the one reliable anchor for the protagonist amidst professional chaos. Their conversations are rarely about plot or character, but about light, shadow, and frame composition, a sanctuary where the language of cinema is pure, unburdened by commercial concerns. The camera work during their silent planning sessions often feels intimate, almost observational, as if the viewer is intruding on a sacred creative pact. The recurring motif of returning to a childhood location or revisiting an early amateur film project is handled with remarkable sensitivity. It's not a nostalgic retreat, but a necessary recalibration. These scenes suggest that the inspiration for standing again, doesn't come from projecting future success, but from reconnecting with the initial, uncorrupted passion that drove them into the industry in the first place. It is a momentary infusion of purity before the inevitable dive back into the murky waters of logistics and compromise. The film suggests that true resilience isn't about never failing, but about continually remembering the why behind the grueling how. The weight carried by the lead character is not just the burden of their current film, but the accumulated weight of every artistic risk taken before it, each one a necessary stepping stone toward this current, precarious moment of self-definition. The emotional tapestry woven throughout Nonton Kembali Berdiri is further deepened by the antagonist's portrayal, specifically the veteran screenwriter whose history in Indonesian cinema predates the protagonist's fervor. This character embodies a weary cynicism, born from decades of witnessing brilliant ideas wither under commercial constraints or political interference. Their dialogue, often elliptical and steeped in local idiom, serves as a constant, gentle prod to the protagonist, forcing a confrontation with the industry's historical inertia. When this screenwriter speaks, it is not with malice, but with the heavy resignation of someone who has learned the hard lessons about the finite nature of artistic leverage. There's a subtle, almost paternal disappointment in their exchanges, suggesting they see their younger counterpart repeating patterns they themselves once pursued with equal intensity. The protagonist's primary source of internal conflict, beyond the external pressures, seems deeply rooted in a fear of irrelevance. This is visually underscored by the brief, jarring flashes of social media commentary integrated into the narrative, snippets of online discourse that range from scathing critiques to hollow praise. These digital intrusions break the film's otherwise carefully controlled aesthetic, symbolizing the modern artist's inability to escape constant, immediate public judgment. The protagonist's reaction to this noise is often withdrawal. We see them physically recoil from their phone, yet they are inextricably tied to its verdict, illustrating the paradox of needing audience validation while simultaneously needing to protect the sanctity of their creative core from it. A particularly poignant character arc belongs to the costume designer, a pragmatic artist whose role is often overlooked in narratives centered on directors and writers. This individual represents the meticulous craft required behind the camera, the tangible realization of a fictional world. Their exchanges with the lead often revolve around the material reality of filmmaking, the budget constraints dictating fabric choices, the necessity of historical accuracy, clashing with shooting schedules. This grounded perspective acts as a vital counterbalance to the protagonist's soaring, sometimes impractical, artistic ambitions. The designer's quiet triumph, achieved through a perfectly sourced, period-appropriate textile, offers a small, hard-won moment of beauty that contrasts sharply with the grand, abstract aspirations of the director. This character grounds the film in the necessary alchemy between dream and execution. The film's commitment to authenticity extends even to the representation of the creative process itself. There are no sweeping moments of sudden inspiration. Instead, inspiration is shown as the residue of obsessive research. Close-ups on stacks of obscure books, historical maps meticulously annotated, or archival film footage viewed late at night paint a picture of relentless intellectual labor. This refusal to romanticize genius elevates the narrative, suggesting that the capacity to stand again is less about innate talent and more about an almost academic dedication to mastering the subject matter and the medium itself. The emotional payoff is therefore derived not from a magical solution appearing, but from the logical, arduous culmination of sustained, focused effort, finally aligning with external opportunity. The narrative structure employs a cyclical rhythm that mirrors the nature of creative careers in volatile industries. The film constantly returns to a specific, almost ritualistic moment. The protagonist standing before a darkened cinema screen, perhaps after a failed screening or before a crucial pitch. This recurring visual acts as a sort of emotional anchor point, a zero-degree state to which the character must constantly return to reassess their direction. This is not merely repetition for effect. It serves to underscore the idea that in this field, true resolution is elusive. Success is temporary, setback is inevitable. Each ascent is merely preparation for the next ascent, and the mastery shown by the actor lies in subtly altering the energy in these repeated moments. The defiance in one instance might be replaced by weary acknowledgement in the next, reflecting the accretion of experience. This cyclical nature is further emphasized by the film's subtle critique of patronage and the dependence on established power structures, reminiscent of historical challenges faced by pioneers in Asian cinema who had to navigate colonial or overtly state-controlled media landscapes. While the current context is one of market forces, the underlying power dynamic remains. The artist must secure the blessing of capital or established tastemakers. A key sequence involves the protagonist attempting to secure distribution through a major local conglomerate, whose executive favors populist genre fare over the director's nuanced drama. The negotiation is portrayed not as a battle of wits, but as a demonstration of sheer stamina. The executive, perhaps influenced by the career path of a massively successful, commercially savvy Indonesian blockbuster director, critiques the film's pacing not from an aesthetic standpoint, but from a perceived lack of immediate audience engagement points. This exchange highlights the generational and philosophical gulf between art created for self-expression and art engineered for consumption, a struggle that informs much of the protagonist's ongoing vulnerability. The physical toll of this constant striving is subtly manifested in recurring physical descriptions. The protagonist is often shown clutching their hands tightly or exhibiting a slight tremor when handling delicate materials like film reels or presentation notes, micro-expressions of internalized anxiety that speak volumes about the pressure to perform flawlessly. Even their choice of attire shifts throughout the film, moving from the slightly rumpled, earnest look of early enthusiasm to sharply tailored, almost defensive professionalism in high-stakes meetings. This sartorial evolution suggests a realization that projecting an image of control is as vital a performance as the film itself. The film posits that the journey to stand again is not just about creative breakthroughs, but about mastering the peripheral performances required to keep the engine of creation funded and visible. The exploration of mentorship within Nonton Kembali Berdiri provides crucial texture to the protagonist's isolated struggle. There is a brief but significant interaction with an older, almost legendary Indonesian filmmaker whose career likely spans the eras of both state-sponsored cinema and the rise of independent voices in the late 20th century. This veteran figure, whose past works are often taught in film academies as exemplars of national cinematic identity, offers advice that is both profound and frustratingly abstract. Their comments often focus on the spirit, or the soul, of the nation reflected in the moving image, themes that are beautiful but offer little tactical guidance on securing distribution or managing union disputes. The protagonist receives this wisdom with reverence, yet the unspoken tension lies in the practical gap. The older generation built their careers under systems that demanded different forms of compromise than the hyper-capitalist, digital-first landscape of today. This scene subtly comments on the nature of inherited artistic wisdom. It is rich in context, but often sparse in contemporary utility. Furthermore, the depiction of the protagonist's artistic inspiration reveals a deep connection not just to film history, but to Indonesian literature and philosophy. Visual cues suggest the director finds structural parallels between their narrative arcs and the cyclical fates depicted in classic Malay novels, or the nuanced moral quandaries presented in specific literary works concerning national identity and modernization. When the protagonist is stuck, they are often shown reading, underlining the idea that their visual language is informed by a broader cultural repository than just cinema. This intellectual underpinning justifies the film's slow, contemplative pacing. It demands that the audience engage with the material on a layered, thoughtful plane, mirroring the director's own immersive research process. The frustration felt by the executives mentioned earlier stems directly from this depth. They see impenetrable academic commitment, where the director sees necessary scaffolding for their vision. The film's emotional climax is cleverly understated, avoiding a conventional triumph. Instead, the turning point involves the protagonist accepting a necessary small defeat, perhaps agreeing to trim a sequence they considered vital, or ceding final cut approval on a minor element to secure essential funding. This concession is shown not as a capitulation, but as a strategic realignment. The camera lingers on the protagonist's face as they sign the revised contract. There is no elation, only a grim satisfaction of having traded a piece of purity for the chance to realize the larger whole. This moment perfectly encapsulates the concept of standing again. It means recognizing when one must bend to survive the next phase, preserving the core ambition by allowing periphery elements to bend first. It's a mature, deeply human portrayal of ambition, tempered by the realities of sustained professional existence in a highly competitive cultural field. The exhaustion is replaced momentarily by calculated resolve. The subtle incorporation of music within the intimate moments of creation deserves further emphasis. There is a scene where the protagonist is reviewing location scouting footage, alone in a dimly lit edit suite. The score here is not music in the traditional sense, but ambient sound. The faint, distant hum of city traffic blended with the rhythmic click of the mouse, almost becoming a percussive element of their concentration. This sonic environment creates an almost trance-like state, suggesting that the true work is done not in the grand pronouncements or the pitch meetings, but in these long, monotonous stretches of solitary decision-making. This auditory austerity contrasts sharply with the often overblown orchestral swells associated with cinematic victory montages, positioning the film firmly within a more realist, perhaps even European art house tradition regarding sound design. Moreover, the portrayal of the protagonist's early life and influences, though sparse, is vital for understanding their current tenacity. A brief flashback sequence, perhaps triggered by the sight of an old, worn 35mm film canister, might hint at a formative experience, maybe witnessing a smuggled print of a forbidden foreign film in a clandestine screening, or the sheer awe inspired by the first local movie that truly captured the complexity of Indonesian life beyond simple propaganda. These fragments suggest that the drive is deeply encoded, almost a moral imperative, rather than mere professional aspiration. The actor conveys this internalized conviction through the set of their jaw when facing setbacks, a silent commitment forged long before the pressures of the contemporary industry began to bear down. This early spark is the fuel that allows them to endure the corrosive effects of bureaucratic stagnation. The film also brilliantly uses environmental degradation as a metaphor for artistic compromise. When scouting locations, the protagonist is often seen reacting with quiet dismay to the rapid modernization or demolition of older, architecturally rich areas that would have served their period piece aesthetic perfectly. This mirrors the sense that their authentic vision is constantly being paved over by generic commercial development, a visual parallel to the way market demands erase unique cultural nuance. The struggle to find a suitably preserved historical backdrop becomes emblematic of the larger battle to preserve a distinct, non-homogenized artistic voice in a rapidly evolving national landscape. Every compromise made on screen reflects a necessary surrender to the relentless march of progress outside the confines of their creative bubble. The relationship with the film's lead actress, often portrayed as the dazzling external face of the project, is surprisingly muted in terms of dramatic interpersonal conflict. Instead of jealousy or rivalry, their connection is rooted in a shared, professional vulnerability. The actress, whose career might be characterized by successful pivots between mainstream entertainment and more challenging dramatic roles, understands the necessity of political maneuvering. She often acts as an unexpected buffer between the director and the financiers, translating the director's esoteric vision into digestible, marketable language for the producers. Her performance, though externally radiant, betrays a deep professional fatigue, the exhaustion of perpetually having to be on and beautiful. This symbiotic relationship, built on mutual respect for the demands placed upon their respective public personas, underscores the film's central theme. Survival in the arts is a collaborative effort that requires strategic alliances against overwhelming external forces. The film's commitment to authenticity extends into the realm of internal bureaucracy, specifically the arduous, often humiliating process of securing necessary clearances and permits. This aspect, usually glossed over in narratives focused solely on the creative spark, is given significant screen time, portrayed with a patient realism that underscores the sheer administrative weight of filmmaking outside established studio systems. We see the protagonist navigating labyrinthine government offices, dealing with low-level functionaries whose power is derived solely from their position within a slow-moving system. The atmosphere in these scenes is often suffocatingly bureaucratic, characterized by endless paperwork, unexplained delays, and the casual arrogance of minor officials. This environment functions as a distinct antagonist, one that cannot be won over with artistic merit or passionate pleading, but only through persistence, detailed compliance, and the deployment of necessary, perhaps morally ambiguous, favors. A subtle nod to the realities faced by filmmakers whose inspirations may have included those who succeeded by mastering the patronage game of an earlier era. The characterization of the film's primary financier, who may have built their fortune in an unrelated sector like property development or logistics, further complicates the ethical landscape. This individual is not portrayed as a Philistine, but rather as someone who views art as another manageable asset class. Their dialogue is peppered with business jargon applied incongruously to creative decisions, referring to character arcs as marketable deliverables or demanding a clearer ROI on emotional beats. This person's inspiration likely stems from successful international business titans who have successfully diversified into media holdings, valuing efficiency and predictability above all else. The tension arises when the director must translate the necessity of a moment of profound, unmarketable silence into terms that equate to financial sense. The actor portraying the director conveys the internal dissonance of having to sell sincerity, a performance within a performance required to keep the project afloat. The film's visual language subtly utilizes the motif of reflection and distortion, often employing glass surfaces or polished floors in scenes of confrontation. When the protagonist argues with a resistant producer, their image is often fractured across the glass partition separating them, suggesting that their vision is being viewed through a distorted, filtered lens dictated by commerce. This technique is more pronounced when the protagonist interacts with their own reflection in hotel bathrooms or rearview mirrors during long drives between cities, moments where the public mask slips, revealing fatigue and questioning the identity that has become inseparable from the difficult project. These visual echoes ensure that the film remains focused internally, even when discussing external business logistics. The true struggle is the maintenance of a coherent self amidst professional fragmentation. Finally, the film subtly honors the resilience of the often invisible technical crew, the grips, the sound mixers, the continuity supervisors. These individuals, whose careers are built on meticulous, unglamorous execution, form a secondary layer of support for the protagonist. A key scene features the sound mixer, perhaps a veteran whose career began in documentary work, quietly fixing a critical technical glitch during a grueling night shoot, offering a word of encouragement steeped not in artistic faith, but in technical competence. The gear is holding, director. We can get the shot. This grounded support system contrasts with the lofty, abstract ambitions of the director, illustrating that standing again requires reliance on a network of professionals whose commitment to craft is as uncompromising as the director's commitment to vision, even if their rewards and recognition are vastly different. This shared, silent professionalism is perhaps the film's most profound statement on enduring artistic community. The emotional weight carried by the protagonist is often externalized through their interactions, or lack thereof, with their immediate physical surroundings during moments of intense creative focus. For instance, in the scene where the director is agonizing over the final cut, the camera lingers on the peeling paint of the rented editing suite wall, or the dust motes dancing in the projector light, details that signal the precarious, borrowed nature of their workspace. This physical environment contrasts sharply with the pristine, aspirational locations depicted in the film within a film, reinforcing the gap between the dream being manufactured and the often shabby reality of its creation. The actor subtly communicates a deep-seated aversion to this instability, yet an equally profound inability to choose a more conventional, secure path. This paradox fuels much of the character's sustained tension. The influence of the lead actor's own career choices on the portrayal warrants consideration. If this actor is known for successfully transitioning between mainstream commercial cinema and art house projects, a common trajectory for highly skilled performers seeking longevity, their embodiment of the director character gains depth. They understand the calculation behind every public appearance, the necessary charm deployed to placate investors, and the internal retreat required to preserve authenticity. Their portrayal of exhaustion is thus layered. It is both the exhaustion of the fictional director and the experienced performer's understanding of the constant public performance demanded by the industry apparatus. This shared meta-awareness elevates the performance beyond mere acting into a form of layered commentary on their profession. A particularly insightful element is the film's handling of intellectual property and creative ownership, a frequent battleground in the globalized film market. There is a sequence detailing the acquisition of music rights or the clearance for using archival footage, a mundane administrative nightmare that threatens to derail the entire project due to unforeseen financial demands. The protagonist's reaction here is not anger, but a chilling, quiet resolve, suggesting a familiarity with being financially leveraged against the very components that define their artistic statement. This battle highlights that true resilience, the ability to stand again, is often found in the meticulous, unsexy process of legal and contractual defense rather than purely creative bursts. The film draws attention to the fact that authorship today is as much about legal guardianship as it is about aesthetic contribution. The film subtly employs the theme of mimicry versus originality through the protagonist's attempts to court younger, social media savvy influencers or critics whose validation they desperately seek but fundamentally distrust. The protagonist tries, awkwardly, to speak their language, adopting contemporary vernacular, only to have it fall flat. Revealing their disconnect from the current zeitgeist they are trying to capture or perhaps subtly critique. This failure to convincingly assimilate into the new digital culture contrasts with the deep historical knowledge they possess about cinema. They are masters of the past, yet awkward apprentices in the present. This struggle speaks volumes about the difficulty of maintaining a unique, resonant voice when the metrics of success are constantly shifting beneath the artist's feet. The visual language emphasizes this divide by often showing the protagonist isolated in a frame, while the digital voices they contend with are presented as a chaotic, fragmented collage of text and ephemeral images surrounding them. The film's exploration of personal sacrifice is perhaps most acutely felt in the portrayal of the protagonist's domestic life, or rather, the intentional erasure of it in service of the film. There are very few scenes featuring personal relationships, and those that exist are strained or viewed through a lens of distraction. A notable moment involves a brief, scheduled video call with an estranged family member, a parent or sibling, where the director is visibly distracted, constantly glancing at script pages or production schedules laid out on the table beside the laptop screen. The dialogue is stilted, filled with preemptive apologies for absence. This conveys not a lack of love, but an absolute prioritization that has tipped into self-neglect. The actor conveys this abandonment not through overt sadness, but through a kind of functional numbness, the emotional bandwidth entirely consumed by the project's demands. This lack of domestic grounding subtly echoes the career arcs of certain celebrated auteurs who became synonymous with their work to the exclusion of all else, paying the price of public adoration with private isolation. The recurring visual metaphor of water, whether it's the relentless tropical rain hitting the windows or the protagonist staring blankly at a glass of water on their desk, serves as an undercurrent of emotional flux. Water often symbolizes cleansing or overwhelming force. In the context of this film, it seems to signify the constant threat of being washed away by market pressures or personal failure. When the protagonist finally achieves a small, necessary victory, the rain often subsides, but the ground remains wet, suggesting that the environment is fundamentally unstable. The calm is merely temporary. This atmospheric sensitivity links the film's internal emotional climate with the external world of Jakarta, making the city itself a character reflecting the protagonist's emotional state. Beautiful, chaotic, and ultimately indifferent to individual struggle. The film smartly integrates the protagonist's background in film education, perhaps hinting at influences from key Indonesian film theorists or educators who emphasized socio-political commentary in cinema. We see brief glimpses of heavily annotated textbooks or dog-eared manifestos that informed their early cinematic philosophy. This intellectual foundation is what the producers and financiers attempt to strip away when they demand marketability. The protagonist's stubbornness, therefore, is not just ego, it is a defense mechanism protecting the core philosophy instilled during their formative learning years. When they resist a suggested dialogue change, it is often framed in terms of fidelity to an established principle rather than mere artistic preference. The actor manages to convey the immense weight of carrying not just a film, but an entire intellectual tradition through a difficult production process. Finally, the theme of standing again is physically embodied in the protagonist's recurring use of physical activity, however brief. Perhaps they attempt morning runs that quickly devolve into labored jogs, or they engage in solitary, repetitive exercises in a small hotel room. These acts are not about health. They are about forcing the body to obey when the mind is under siege. It is a desperate attempt to control the physical self when the creative self feels utterly out of control. This tangible depiction of physical endurance as a parallel to artistic perseverance provides a grounded counterpoint to the often ethereal nature of creative ambition, solidifying the understanding that resilience in this field is an integrated, total body commitment. The film's visual lexicon concerning the past is further enriched by the deliberate choice of film stock or digital emulation, utilized when presenting archival footage or the protagonist's own early formative works. If the early efforts are rendered in the grainy, high-contrast look of saturated 16mm film, it immediately establishes a tactile link to a pre-digital era of filmmaking, one that prioritized visible craft and physical media. This texture stands in stark opposition to the crisp, often overly clean digital sheen of the current production, visually marking the aesthetic distance the protagonist feels they have traveled, perhaps regrettably, from their origins. This contrast is a constant, silent judgment on the compromises made in pursuit of modern viability. The role of the lead actress, whose external success often overshadows the director's behind-the-scenes struggles, is crucial in illustrating the different forms of industry pressure. Her career likely involves a tightrope walk between maintaining audience appeal through popular genres, perhaps Indonesian romantic comedies or visually spectacular action films, and seeking critical validation through the director's more demanding art project. This dichotomy means she carries a different, yet equally heavy, form of strategic burden. There is a moment where she critiques the director's script, not as a writer, but as a market analyst, advising on how a certain emotional beat needs to be signposted more clearly for mass consumption. Her advice, while professionally sound from a commercial perspective, stings the director precisely because it is delivered with the objective certainty of someone who has successfully monetized their own artistic compromises. Her inspiration is survival through adaptation, making her an unwitting foil to the director's quest for purity. The theme of delayed gratification is masterfully interwoven with the financial narrative. The producers, driven by the need to show immediate returns, constantly push for speed, contrasting with the director's insistence on lengthy, evocative takes that demand more time and, consequently, more money. A sequence involving a crucial reshoot, necessitated by a last-minute bureaucratic hurdle, is fraught not with shouting, but with tense, whispered calculations between the director and the line producer. Every extra hour on set feels like a direct theft from the film's already precarious future. This constant micromanagement of time illustrates that in the modern industry, creative vision is constantly held hostage by the clock and the ledger, a significant departure from the perceived freedom of earlier cinematic movements, referenced in the film's conceptual framework. The film concludes not with a premiere, but often with the solitary act of the director watching the film for the first time in a completely empty screening room, long after the cast and crew have moved on. This final, quiet viewing is stripped of all audience reaction, executive scrutiny, or critical interpretation. It is the purest form of engagement left. The emotion displayed here is a complex blend of relief, exhaustion, and a faint spark of pride, swiftly followed by the immediate, practical anxiety of the next project. This ending powerfully reinforces the film's central thesis. The standing is never permanent. The act of continuing, of immediately starting the internal process for the next endeavor, is the only true, sustainable form of success one can claim. The applause of the crowd is fleeting. The silence of the empty theater before the next commitment begins is the defining landscape of the dedicated artist. The protagonist's relationship with their own artistic legacy is subtly explored through the recurring motif of an unfinished manuscript or an abandoned early screenplay left scattered on their desk. This forgotten project represents the untainted, pure ambition that existed before the necessities of production, financing, and audience expectations intervened. When the director briefly picks up the brittle pages, the texture of the paper itself seems to signify a forgotten era of pure artistic intent, one perhaps inspired by the uncompromising, politically engaged cinema of the late 1960s or early 1970s in Indonesia, where thematic resonance often outweighed commercial viability. The actor conveys a fleeting moment of longing, immediately suppressed by the pressing demands of the current, compromised work. This physical interaction with the past serves as an internal barometer. How far have they strayed from the initial core belief? The film pays homage to the resilience of technical craftspeople through the character of the veteran sound designer, whose expertise lies in capturing the authentic sonic environment of Jakarta, the specific quality of street vendor calls, the unique roar of local traffic, the layered echoes within historic government buildings. This character, whose career spans analog recording to digital mixing, becomes the guardian of the film's realism against the producer's desire for slick, generic soundscapes. Their dedication is shown during a fraught sound mixing session where they argue fiercely against digital noise reduction, insisting that the imperfection, the faint background hiss, is necessary to anchor the drama in a verifiable reality. This technical battle mirrors the director's larger philosophical struggle against homogenization, highlighting that authenticity is often found in what others deem noise. A particularly compelling layer is added by the protagonist's interaction with the young, ambitious line producer, a figure whose career is entirely built within the current fast-paced digital ecosystem, perhaps mirroring the success of contemporary media entrepreneurs who specialize in rapid content delivery. This producer views the director's meticulous approach with barely concealed impatience, advocating for streamlined shooting schedules and readily available digital assets over location scouting and custom set builds. The conflict here is generational and technological. The director seeks permanence and texture. The producer seeks speed and scalable output. The director's attempts to explain the necessity of waiting for the specific quality of light, an echo of masters who understood light manipulation intimately, are met with blank stares, reinforcing the sense that the language of cinematic pursuit has fundamentally changed, requiring the director to learn a new dialect of persuasion. The emotional denouement, which avoids catharsis, focuses instead on the protagonist looking out over the city skyline from a high vantage point. This is not a view of promised success, but one of vast, overwhelming scale. The city below appears indifferent to the small, intense battles fought within the screening rooms and production offices. This visual framing suggests that standing again is not about conquering the industry, but about accepting one's small, persistent place within a massive, uncaring system. The final emotion captured is a quiet, almost grim determination, the knowledge that the next cycle of struggle is already underway, and the capacity to endure it is the only true asset the artist possesses. It's a profound statement that in the volatile world of national cinema, survival is the ultimate artistic achievement. The narrative subtly weaves in the protagonist's private rituals of self-soothing, demonstrating the thin line between focused discipline and compulsive behavior. Before major confrontations, such as the mandatory meeting with the cultural ministry liaison, the director is shown meticulously cleaning their reading glasses, a gesture so precise it borders on obsessive. This small act of imposing order on a manageable, tangible object provides a temporary illusion of control before facing the amorphous, frustrating power of bureaucracy. The actor invests this gesture with a deep, almost spiritual significance. It is a moment of purification before entering the fray, suggesting that the fight for artistic freedom is inherently linked to maintaining personal meticulousness in the face of overwhelming chaos. The secondary character of the lead actress is further illuminated by showing her own navigation of public expectation, which often requires her to project an image of effortless glamour entirely antithetical to the director's grounded exhaustion. In a pivotal scene where the actress is required for a promotional event, a necessary evil to maintain financing interest, she arrives late, visibly drained from a previous commitment. Her public performance is flawless. Radiant smiles, perfectly calibrated sound bites about artistic collaboration. However, backstage, just before stepping onto the stage, she exchanges a loaded, silent look with the director. This glance is a mutual acknowledgement of the exhausting duality they both inhabit. One selling the surface spectacle, the other wrestling with the underlying substance, both equally bound by the need to perform for capital. This shared, unspoken understanding becomes a bedrock of their professional bond, a testament to solidarity among those tasked with bearing the visible weight of the enterprise. The theme of creative inheritance is revisited through the protagonist's relationship with the physical archives of Indonesian film making. When seeking specific visual references for a historical sequence, the director visits a poorly maintained, dimly lit state archive. The air is thick with the smell of decaying film stock and mildew, a physical representation of history being poorly preserved. In contrast to the pristine digital efficiency of modern production, the director finds genuine inspiration here. A single, fleeting frame from a long-forgotten B-movie that perfectly captures the necessary mood. This discovery is treated with the reverence of uncovering a lost relic. The protagonist carefully handles the brittle print, illustrating that true originality often requires digging into the physical residue of past failures and lesser-known successes, rather than merely referencing contemporary trends. The culmination of the financial negotiation arc is depicted not as a clear victory, but as a tense equilibrium achieved through strategically placed concessions. The protagonist yields control over the final music score, a sacrifice that clearly wounds them, but in return secures veto power over the principal photography edit. This trade-off is framed as a necessary triage, sacrificing the emotional punctuation, the score, to maintain the integrity of the visual narrative, the edit. The moment the agreement is sealed, the protagonist doesn't celebrate. Instead, they walk out into the relentless Jakarta heat, shedding the air-conditioned pressure cooker of the boardroom. The external sensory shock, the sudden blast of humidity and noise, acts as a physical jolt, forcing the character out of the sterile negotiation space and back into the lived reality of the city, ready to face the next set of tangible problems the newly secured funding presents. The final shot of this sequence focuses not on the director's face, but on their hand, gripping the car door handle, a tight, white-knuckled hold that signifies the tenuous grip they have on their creation. Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Real Thread channel. If you are new here, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. Today, we are going to be discussing the film Nonton Kembali Berdiri. The narrative unfurls, drawing us into the life of a figure whose trajectory, much like many celebrated artists, is marked by both dazzling heights and the quiet erosion of self. We follow this individual whose creative output has often been critically acclaimed, a testament to a rigorous discipline honed over years spent mastering their craft, perhaps drawing inspiration from the relentless perfectionism of classical masters or the raw emotional honesty of early cinema pioneers. Their early successes weren't accidental. They were built on a foundation of relentless practice. Late nights spent in solitary pursuit of the perfect angle or the most resonant note. Yet, the story quickly shifts, introducing the insidious nature of burnout, the slow fading of the initial spark that once fueled such prodigious talent. There's a sense that the very system that elevated this person now conspires to drain them. We see glimpses of past triumphs, perhaps a universally loved performance, or a groundbreaking piece of work that redefined a genre, moments that now feel distant, almost belonging to someone else. The weight of expectation, that invisible cloak woven from public adoration and critical analysis, begins to chafe. The film then introduces a counterpoint, perhaps a younger protege, or an unexpected collaborator whose own path is yet unburdened by the industry's heavy hand. This new connection serves as a mirror, reflecting not just what the protagonist has lost, but also the pure, unadulterated joy of creation that they once possessed. This younger spirit might be motivated by an almost naive ambition, perhaps inspired by the very works of our protagonist that now feel like artifacts from a bygone era. What follows is a journey of rediscovery, not necessarily a dramatic return to superstardom, but a more intimate excavation of personal meaning. The protagonist is forced to confront the roles they have played, both on screen and off, and distinguish the curated public persona from the fragile, authentic self beneath. There are moments of stark honesty, scenes where the practiced facade cracks, revealing vulnerability that is far more compelling than any manufactured drama. The narrative suggests that true resilience isn't about instantly recapturing past glory. It's about the slow, often painful process of reassembling one's identity outside the context of professional achievement. We witness the protagonist engaging with their art in a new way, perhaps stepping away from the massive studio productions that demanded conformity and returning to smaller, more intimate projects where the stakes feel personal rather than commercial. The resolution isn't necessarily a tidy bow, but rather a quiet acceptance. The inspiration that drove the early career has transformed. It is no longer about proving something to the world, but about sustaining a personal flame. The film leaves us with the impression that the act of standing back up, of continuing to create despite the scars, is in itself the ultimate achievement, a testament to an enduring spirit that refuses to be defined solely by the spotlight it once commanded. It's a recognition that sometimes the most profound performances are the ones lived when the cameras are finally turned off. The camera lingers on the protagonist's hands, not performing some grand gesture of artistic genius, but simply gripping a worn coffee mug, the tremor noticeable only to a discerning eye, an eye perhaps trained by years of watching themselves under intense scrutiny. This character, let's call them the maestro of melancholy, had built a reputation on roles steeped in profound internal conflict. Roles that demanded an almost painful level of emotional exposure, a testament to their early training in method acting, where every breath was accounted for, every nuance explored until it bled into authenticity. We remember that documentary from years past, the one where they spoke about drawing deeply from the well of their own adolescent alienation to fuel their breakthrough performance in that independent film that shocked the establishment. That raw energy is now muted, replaced by a careful economy of movement, a self-preservation mechanism kicking in after years of having every raw nerve laid bare for public consumption. The tension escalates not through external conflict, but through the internal friction between the celebrated image and the exhausted human beneath. Their former inspiration, that ferocious desire to capture the fleeting truth of human experience, now feels like a relentless, demanding creditor. The pressure to constantly innovate, to surpass the impossibly high bar set by their own previous milestones, that Oscar-winning turn, that musical composition that became the soundtrack to a generation's first heartbreak, has calcified into a kind of creative paralysis. It's the curse of the prodigy. Once you've touched genius, everything else feels like compromise. Enter the foil, perhaps a young documentarian or a struggling musician whose own burgeoning career is marked by an almost reckless disregard for commercial viability. This younger artist possesses an almost shocking clarity, unburdened by the ghost of past masterpieces. Their approach to their art is messy, collaborative, filled with laughter that feels alien in the hushed, sterile environment the protagonist now inhabits. This newcomer doesn't want guidance so much as they want permission to fail publicly, something the established figure has never allowed themselves to do since they were an unknown scrambling for stage time in dimly lit black box theaters. This interaction forces the protagonist to recall the sheer, unadulterated fun of making something new before metrics and market predictions suffocated the initial impulse. The emotional climax arrives not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet moment of surrender. Perhaps while reviewing old footage, not their celebrated work, but early, clumsy home videos or rehearsal tapes, the protagonist sees the unpolished hunger they've spent decades refining out of existence. There is a profound sadness in recognizing the gap between that eager beginner and the guarded veteran. The film beautifully illustrates that recovery isn't about finding the old self, but about acknowledging the accumulated wisdom and the necessary armor forged in the fires of fame. The journey back to standing involves realizing that the audience doesn't need another replica of the past. They need the honest, present reality of someone who has weathered the storm. The final scene might show them picking up an instrument or a forgotten script, the action tentative, yes, but imbued with a new, fragile sense of self-determination, suggesting that the greatest performance of all is simply showing up for your own life, regardless of the applause meter. The weariness etched around the protagonist's eyes tells a story far richer than any script they've ever memorized. This is the look of someone who has spent a lifetime perfectly calibrating their vulnerability for public consumption, a technique perhaps learned from studying the deeply layered performances of cinematic icons who understood the power of suggestion over outright display. Their career ascent was meteoric, fueled by an almost obsessive dedication to research. We hear anecdotal whispers of them living for months in isolated environments to fully inhabit complex historical figures, a dedication that verged on self-immolation in the name of authenticity. This intense method, initially their greatest strength, became the cage that held them captive, demanding continuous, unsustainable levels of personal sacrifice. The pressure to maintain that illusion of effortless brilliance manifests in small, telling details, the way they meticulously check their reflection before entering a room, ensuring the mask is firmly in place, or the clipped, almost defensive tone they adopt when asked about their current creative direction. The inspiration that once flowed like an untamed river, the raw, electric energy of seizing an idea and running with it, has now been reduced to carefully managed trickles, dictated by contractual obligations and the relentless calculus of brand management.